There's some tremendous experience on the table here, both on the governmental side as well as on the private sector side. And then we're going to go into some of the topics that, frankly, I was very inspired at the lunch with Commissioner McAleenan, as well as the couple of the panel discussions this morning. There's a lot of information that came out of those that I think we're going to be talking about today, and kind of piggybacking on some of the learnings that we had in the previous sessions, I think most of you were there. But so Alan Gina is the co-founder of CT Strategies, which is a strategic services firm that provides innovative insight into border management and supply chain challenges. I think what's interesting about Alan is that he spent over 30 years at CBP and handling different programs, and I think that his leadership capabilities were certainly seen there. He led the most extensive trade transformation initiative in CBP's history. He's a pioneer and a leader in developing broad and far-reaching national and international programs to support anti-terrorism and trade transformation policies. He's been conferred the rank of Meritorious Executive by the President of the United States. So tremendous amount of experience that he's now bringing into the private sector. And frankly, I think we need that. We need the execution side. We need the implementation side. How do we actually do this? How do we make it happen? And then Eric Lee is a friend. We see a lot of Eric in the southwestern part of the United States. He's a man who's not only does he do the research side of things, he's executive director of the North American Research Partnership, but he also is in the trenches. He's been to the ports. He's done a lot of work at the ports, blood, sweat, and tears in many cases, because you do put in a lot of time and effort in that. Arizona, California primarily, but I know you've worked with other border communities. And one of the efforts that he led some years ago, which was sort of a favorite of the coalitions, is the comprehensive analysis of the U.S. Mexico border region in 2013, realizing the strategic national value of our trade. And he's also now the managing editor for North America Next, a report to President Obama on building sustainable security and competitiveness. That was done in 2009. But he's also, and very recently, involved in Border Fusion, which is a very interesting microzone project at the San Ysidro border, the cities of San Ysidro and the downtown Tijuana areas, and how to integrate those and how to make that area sort of the heart of the border, rather than a place where people go and try to get out of there as fast as possible. So that's something that I think deserves a lot of merit, along with the other people who've cooperated with you in that regard. Stan is Ambassador Bridge. He's one of our sponsors today, and so of course is CT Strategies. And Stan is the director since 2013 of security and Canadian government relations at Ambassador Bridge. So he's going to bring in the Canadian perspective, which I think this morning we didn't have enough of. Honestly, I think we've been very much southern border centric. We need to bring that Canadian opinion, and more so because of what we've heard lately in terms of the G7 conversations and such. So we might give you a little bit of a hard time, Stan, but I think you'll fight back very well. So we'll bring it on. And so Stan worked as sergeant for the Ontario Provincial Police for 18 years until 2003. He has also been vice president of Blue Water Bridge Canada and the president of the Public Border Operations Association. And then finally, last but not least, Ben Rohrbach. Ben is a principal at Border Works Advisors, but he's held some very interesting positions as senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security from 2014 to 2016. He served as the director for enforcement and border security at the National Security Council in the White House. He was responsible for border management with Mexico and Canada, and developed a new council to prioritize border infrastructure investments across the U.S. government. And he's also been a senior advisor to the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, and he served as a director for national security within the White House Office of Presidential Personnel. So a lot of experience in terms of White House, Customs and Border Protection. Well, I thank you for participating today. I think we're going to open up to some presentations from all of you. But I just want to quickly mention and why this is important, and in light of the last few conversations we had about the actual port management, port design. But I'm going to focus more on the port management side. At the end of the day, this is not so much a technology centered set of solutions. It is really more of a people management situation. If we can manage people better at the ports, whether Mexico, Canada, or the United States, I think we're going to do a much better job in terms of the flows and in terms of implementing technologies that, of course, exist and that can solve problems. So I'm going to try to steer the conversation in that direction for port management. We know a number of things. The ports, wait times, costs billions and billions of dollars, depending on which study you look at. We know that there is a $5 billion deficit in terms of port infrastructure investment just in the U.S., let alone, of course, Canada and Mexico. We do see that our success in terms of population growth, in terms of trade growth, of course, that we've talked about so much this morning, has produced all kinds of results, some good, some bad. Some of the bad ones, I guess, is that we can't manage the ports fast enough to take into consideration all this growth. And there's been some very interesting projects, great innovations. Just in our region, in Tijuana, San Diego, we have CBX, which probably most of you know about. You've heard of Otay Mesa East, which is a completely new port. Not a lot of that going on the southern border. And there's other ambitious things going on in Anzalduas, in Dana. The commissioner was just mentioning that in terms of non-intrusive technologies. So I want to pose first and foremost the question about technology implementation at the border. So we hear about all these great innovations, projects, but to the outside observer, to some of us, many of us, we feel that the process to implement these technologies it's pretty slow. Maybe it's because it's hasn't been consolidated in a structural way. But I'd like to understand from you what your opinion is on how to accelerate that growth, how to implement these technologies better in light of the management challenges we have. So whoever wants to start.
Want me to start?
Go ahead, Alan.
So for transparency, good morning. Thank you to the Wilson Center. Thank you to all of you who came back after lunch. It's always nice to speak to faces. For transparency and awareness, so my comments will come from my biases, my paradigm. I spent 15 years as a uniformed officer in the field. JFK, Jacksonville, Orlando, came to headquarters in '96 with the expectation I would go back out into the field in another uniform position. 9/11 happened, and I became what is known in CBP as a headquarters lifer. So I spent my last 15 years at DHS and then back at CBP. So my perspective is slightly different. So I got to live through some attempts to create perimeter security. Remember, right after 9/11, if you create a perimeter security around all of North America, you will alleviate congestion at the northern and the southern border. However, you would have to have almost identical, if not harmonized, policies, laws, regulations relative to people, cargo, and conveyances in all three countries. So that presented significant challenges. We also, in the examples that Commissioner McAleen had indicated and some of the comments this morning, you have unified cargo processing. So whether you call it pre-clearance, pre-inspection, pre-examination, you're basically, again, reiterating the creation of what we refer to as Dallas, for example, is the functional equivalent of the border. It doesn't sit on the perimeter, but it's always easier in the air environment because you can maintain the sterility of the aircraft. Once it's wheeled up, it's sterile until it's wheeled down. So no matter where that aircraft lands, anywhere in the U.S., you can process cargo and people entering the U.S. In the land environment, rail, sea, foot traffic, personal owned vehicles, bus traffic, it's much more difficult. So you're really creating an extension of these pre-clearance locations at these pre-unified, but the infrastructure requirements are still going to be required is how do you maintain the sterility from point A to point B? So I would kind of offer up from my biases, I think two things are absolutely paramount for the ports of the future. Screen at speed and run the operation live. And let me give you a quick example of what I mean by both those. Screen at speed, I think, is necessary to, I want everybody to go home tonight and query on YouTube, Hong Kong apartment transformation. And I think what we have to start thinking of, not bringing the cargo conveyances and people to the port, but how do we move the port around the people? It was that Hong Kong architect who said, how do I take a very small apartment and rather people move around an apartment or rather people move around your house, 80% of your house is never occupied by you. How do you move the apartment through movable walls? How do you move the house around you? I think because of what you indicated, the real estate is so precious, people are not willing to give up large footprints to put in large pieces of technology. It takes up too much precious space. In the airports, our airports of today have become retail. They've become basically going to a shopping mall. And I hate going to shopping malls. But that's how they generate additional retail. So I think you got to move it around. There are absolutely examples. Putting VACUS, large-scale imaging equipment, on rail lines. The VACUS went to the rail lines. The trains didn't come to the port. Global entry. You don't have to present yourself anymore to that, what used to be the immigration determining the admissibility, then the customs determining what you're carrying is dutiable, and the ag inspector is what you're carrying is admissible, any kind of fruits and products. You just, as indicated this morning, I told him he should stop exercising. He wouldn't have broke his thumb, and he could have put his fingerprints on the global entry in a much easier way. But you go off to the side, and you process through. There's a company, and I'm sure there's others, but just because of what they did, L3 created a common viewer. It was done in Rotterdam for 5 years before the U.S. finally tried to adopt it, and that means you could take an image from any manufacturer of large-scale imaging equipment, and you could bring it all to a separate location. Why does that have to be done on the port? It doesn't. You can have these command centers off the port. And license plate readers. There's a company, Perceptics, that deploys every license plate reader for CBP. But on the Peace Bridge, they decided, let's take the license plate reader, let's put it on the Canadian side, and you'll check the truck traffic to make sure that they, one, electronically submitted their manifest, and two, paid their customs decal user fee before they get on the bridge to alleviate traffic. So I think screen at speed, which basically means as I drive from here to New York once a month, my Easy Pass, I never have to stop. And I don't know how much tolls I pay now, probably like $100 between here and New York and back. But I'm happy. I continue to go at speed, and that's what has to be done at the port. The other question, run the operation live. I'm a big sports fanatic. During the playoffs of a year or two ago, it was Kevin Plank from Under Armour who basically talked about using technology to run the operation live. For CBP to run the operation live, to keep up with the technology, to maintain that screen at speed, it does not have the computing capability. It just doesn't. The computers don't work fast enough. They don't have the technology that will give instantaneous response. Having worked in the ports of entry for 15 years, I know. You're trying to move that cargo as quickly as possible. Passengers can't wait. Truck drivers can't wait. And trying to get answers, we don't have the infrastructure and or the computing capability in order to do it. And I think it needs that advanced computer if you're really going to do predictive analysis. Not doing enhanced visualization on these various tools, which is just an enhanced dashboard. Not doing link analysis when they're really only doing the linkage, they're not doing the analysis. But true machine learning, artificial intelligence that I think the commissioner may have alluded to is going to allow for that screen at speed and run the port live, as Kevin Plank says. Those are my thoughts.
Oh, thank you for that. Eric, so Alan is talking about what what should happen, I guess. And screening at speed, running operations live, perhaps it is not, CP is not capable yet of doing that, but at some point it may be. So if we look at, we discussed UCP, Unified Cargo Processing, this morning a little bit. Is that sort of a precursor to that kind of situation? Do you think it's going to evolve into a much better system? What are you looking at there?
Yeah, great question, great response from Alan, really inspiring. It's also, for me, it's very interesting to hear from Jose Martin Garcia about how this program, the Unified Cargo Processing Program, is being considered within the discussions on trade facilitation in the NAFTA renegotiation, along with other programs. So I'm very focused on UCP right now, so that's a bit of a knuckleball question for me. I think we're definitely in a period of flux right now, a period of transition, and possibly, if the NAFTA renegotiation goes on, if the three countries hang in there and get this done, and you bring that trade facilitation, that whole set of the trade facilitation part of the agreement into the equation, then I think it's a whole different ballgame altogether. I think codifying that into a treaty puts us on a whole different playing field going forward. So a bit of a difficult question for me to answer right now with my laser focus on UCP, but just taking Alan's response into consideration, as well as this information from Jose Martin Garcia this morning, I think this is definitely a transition period. In other words, the PowerPoint that I'm presenting today may be out of date in a very short time. So, and I'm glad to present it later if you'd like.
No, we can definitely talk about it if you'd like. I wanted to say something about, and this is a little bit what Stan and I were talking about right before we started, which is benchmarking, and using what we have available to us now to improve the efficiencies at the ports. And we talked about a very simple example. Why don't the ports open 24 hours, the cargo ports on the southern border? And many of you will say, well, it's because of personnel issues. Well, that's not always the case, especially on the northern border. So I don't know, Stan, if you'd like to just mention a few things regarding what is happening on the northern border, since I think a lot of the conversation today is this morning is focused on the southern border. And then we'll certainly get into other commentary regarding the management side of things. But if you like to.
First, everybody be at ease. I'm a Canadian, but I'm not a security threat to anybody here. Although we did burn down the White House, I guess, apparently in 1812. But Ben's going to give me some dairy and some cheese, and I'll bring it because it's a lot cheaper over here.
Softwood lumber.
Yeah, some softwood lumber. Let me give you the state of the northern border. I think it's pretty important for you folks to know what's going on in the northern border. We do have a lot of issues. I'm a proud member of the BTA and been down all the southern border, so I can see the differences and not having a 24/7 port. The Ambassador Bridge in Detroit, we're the busiest border crossing on the Canada-U.S. border. We used to be the busiest in North America, but I think Laredo's ahead of us now. But we'll do anyway about 12,000 trucks a day and about that number of vehicles a day across our bridge. It's very busy, but it's 24/7. If it wasn't 24/7, the auto industry, I think, would be just pounding on everybody's door. The just-in-time delivery, the 2-hour window from the seat being made in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and the cars being made, or the SUV on the others in Detroit at the same time, they got 2 hours to get from there so that seat goes on the loading dock and goes right to the vehicle. So predictability at the border, and some of these assembly plant operations are running 24/7. Or 6 days a week, but 24 hours a day. So it's really important that everything works well at the border. We talked about ACE outages. That's a biggie for us. And as we get more and more technology, you can rely on it. Go to a grocery store. And if the system goes down, the poor guy or girl at the cashier doesn't know how to make change anymore. You know, they have to go to manual modes to process trucks. So it really has a big effect at us. We talked about airports. They're so far ahead of us in processing people coming in from out of the country. It seems like the land borders we're getting at the tail end of this stuff. But there is some good things happening, and I don't know if you want to get into those a little bit later. But a couple other issues in the northern border. You know, pot's going to be legalized in Canada sometime this summer. Buy stock in potato chips. Yeah, good thing, Ben.
Thank you, sir.
You know, what's going to happen? How's that going to affect you know, the northern border? And I've been talking about this for a while. Like, I used to be a cop, and you know, today you'll have some in Detroit, some college kids going across the border into Windsor for a weekend, go to the casino, have some fun, come back, CBP officer, everything's clear. No, you're done. Now that pot is legalized, recreational marijuana, you know, that CBP officer is going to be probably, you know, maybe they, you know, went to the store and picked up a few to bring home, or the, you know, organized crime gets involved with it. It's kind of like I was talking to somebody, we had prohibition 100 years ago where booze was coming from across the river from Canada into Detroit because it was prohibited here. So is that same thing going to happen? Yeah, so there are some differences. We don't, and we heard from the commissioner, you know, the immigration problem and the drug problem right now is not as prevalent on the northern border as it is on the southern border. So some things are the same. The technologies, you know, I'll say about the infrastructure at border crossings. Our bridge is 90 years old. It's a 4-lane bridge. We're going to build a brand new one, 6-lane bridge right next to it with our own private money. We're a private company owned by the Maroon family, and we're going to invest $500 million to build a brand new bridge there, only because it'll have lanes for Nexus and fast and some shoulders, so just widen the bridge. It's not because of traffic volumes. In fact, I don't know if you know this, traffic across the Canada-U.S. border since 1999, so pre-9/11, truck traffic and car traffic is down about 36%. At our bridge, you think 12,000 trucks is a lot every day. Well, that's 42% lower than what it was in 1999. So, and it's continued to go down, and we're pretty well flattening out. Coincidentally, northern border, and this is between Ontario, Michigan, and Ontario, New York. That's the vast majority. 75% of land trade goes across our borders there. That down 30-some%. I think the southern border is up about that 30%. So when you look at where resources should go, you know, Canada wants to build another bridge a mile away from us. It's going to cost $7 billion or something, and we're wondering, well, with traffic going down, you know, you're going to spend $7 billion on a new bridge. We're going to do it with our own money. But then there's going to have to be customs officers' resources to this new bridge that Canada wants to build, CBP officers, to the tune of, it'll be a cost about, they'll need 350 officers. So, I don't know, about $74 million a year in salaries, wages, and all that stuff. When you could be using those resources to go to the southern border where it's really needed. So there, you know, in somebody taught, where do you put the infrastructure? Where do you put the people? Look at what's happening.
It's a question of prioritization, I think, and consolidation of information. I think I want to, before I get back to Eric regarding the investment side of things and how this kind of presentation that he's going to show us is going to kind of spur the investment in the right places. Ben, a long time ago, I took a course called Technology and Operations Management. The very few things I still remember from that course are that, you know, you always had to find where the bottlenecks were. Okay, where are the bottlenecks and how do we deal with them? I'm surprised we haven't, maybe there has been some, but at least I haven't heard too much about it in terms of, you know, Q theory and looking at a border point and saying, you know, what's really going on there and how can we improve what we've got? We typically will talk about hiring people or the turnover that some of these staffs have, both on the Mexican and the U.S. side, or we'll talk about the fact that we just don't have enough people to be in these operations, right? To be at the booths or what have you. In your experience as well as a student of operations management and some technologies, what is your take on that? How should we look at these borders before we actually implement the technology?
Thank you very much, Gustavo. It's a great question, and I want to thank Chris and the Wilson Center team for having us here today. So I think that what you're alluding to, this way of taking a look at borders perhaps a little differently and applying some of the lessons we understand from research that's been done on manufacturing processes and the way that dependent processes can work can be really instructive for the way we think about improving processing and speeding processing at the borders, and provide a way to sort of get beyond what the traditional problems that we all understand. The lack of adequate the lack of adequate staffing, the older infrastructure that's not at all designed for a post 9/11 security environment. And so a colleague and I have been doing a lot of work on this. And one of the things that the way we dug into it is to first try and take a look at just sort of how much demand there is that could be unleashed by reducing transaction costs at the border. And there have been a number of studies about this. There's one in the San Diego, Tijuana area that said it was about $7 billion a year for the region. There's another one in Ontario and Michigan that came up with a similar number for that region. The government of Canada came up with one that said that I think it was about $30 billion for the northern border. This was about 10 years ago. But there's another study that was done by an academic where he actually went through and compared trade between Canadian provinces and then between provinces and states to look at the sort of real costs of the different regulatory regimes and the delays at the border. And what he found was pretty remarkable. He went through and compared things like the level of trade between Ontario and between British Columbia, and then Ontario and California. And so California is 10 times as big a market as British Columbia. It's about the same distance. Canada and the U.S. are, in terms of regulatory environments and cultures, about as close as you can possibly get with any two different countries. And instead, trade was 3 times higher with British Columbia. So we don't know exactly how much demand is pent up because of the different transaction costs involved in crossing the border. But we know it's big. Maybe it's not 30 times for everything, but it's not 10% or something like that. And so the way that when we tried to think this through and think about how we can actually apply sort of some different ways of thinking, different paradigms to speeding border crossings, was to take a lot of the work that's been done to speed manufacturing and feed, in terms of factories, in terms of the way you deal with chains of processes where everything's dependent, and to apply some of the insights that have been done in that field to the way we look at moving things across the border, because obviously people are doing a lot of work in that space and having some really, really sophisticated ideas about it. And when you think about the way something moving from point A to point B, either a person leaving a destination to go to another destination, or cargo being loaded on a truck to eventually get to another factory or be distributed or something, it's a dependent process. Everything has to happen in order. You can't load the truck after it crosses the border. I mean, this is obvious, but it's a different, it's instructive when you think about it. And so looking at supply chain theory and out of this, what you see is that bottlenecks have, a certain small number of bottlenecks tend to have a really disproportionate effect on the overall throughput. And there won't be 5 different bottlenecks or 10 different bottlenecks in a process. There will be 1 or 2 places where the delays can be much larger than anywhere else that have that really govern the overall level of throughput. And the reason for this is because you can essentially have unlimited negative effects when you have delays, but the positive effects are limited. And so the border environment, that's pretty obvious, where you could have something could be delayed for 2 hours at the border, but it can't drive the next leg of their trip and make up 2 hours, or at least not legally or safely. And so the place, if you were looking at a factory or something where you had steps A through F and looking to try and find where the bottlenecks are, what you'd look for is a bunch of work in process inventory. And that's pretty clear where that is. If you look at goods moving between Mexico and the United States or back and forth, it's at the border. That's the lines or the work in process. And so that provides, I think, 2 then insights about the way we think about ports of entry that I think are a little bit different than the traditional way we look at them. When you have a bottleneck in a factory setting, or when you're trying to deal with it, the first thing you do is to absolutely maximize throughput at the bottleneck. You take it and you subordinate the rest of the process to make sure that you're getting absolute maximum throughput at that point. And in the context of border crossings, that is different from the way that both government and communities, I think, have looked at them. For a community on the border, your incentive is to have a large crossing with as much happening as possible. You have a passenger crossing, you want it to be passenger and cargo. You want as much happening in the area because that leads to development in your community. And for a government, for federal officials, it's easier to manage lots of things if they're all in a central place. You want things centralized. You want to be able to make sure that you can see what all your officers are doing and handle things that way. But that's not the way you would treat ports of entry if you were thinking about overall throughput in the process. If you are trying to make sure that you're using this, you're reducing the crossing costs at the bottleneck as much as you possibly can, there are sort of two things you would do. And so one is focus on putting like traffic together as much as possible so that it can be processed as quickly as possible. And then the second would be moving any processing that's being done at the ports that doesn't have to be away from there. And so on the first side, that would mean really thinking through, are there situations where there should be ports that are more specialized than other ones? And are there ways where limiting what can be done in certain places to focus traffic in certain places could result in a faster overall level of processing for the larger population of people moving back and forth? And then the other piece of that, the insight that processes that don't absolutely have to be done should be moved away. I think that there's an interesting question about whether there's certain things right now that are done largely for convenience and consolidation purposes, things like safety inspections for federal highways or other things that are all attached to existing ports, some of the other inspections that are not sort of core national security or immigration or customs functions, whether those should be moved away. And there could be a situation where even though it's slightly more inefficient for certain parts of the population, it'll make the overall throughput faster, in which case we should see some really interesting results in the volume of people coming through. So one example, I think, that shows the possibility of this kind of approach and perhaps the viability of some of these ideas is what Gustavo mentioned earlier with the cross-border express, where you have a crossing that only does one thing. It only allows ticketed passengers to move between the San Diego area and the Tijuana airport. And what we've seen is that has opened up a large amount of demand that previously didn't exist, where people were not willing to drive around and go through the normal port of entry and come and park their cars and fly and then come back and drive around because of the other transaction costs there. But by removing those, suddenly there's a huge amount of demand that we've seen. And so I would present this as a perhaps different way of thinking about the bottlenecks we have on the border and the way that we treat those, where instead of just focusing on, okay, I would like, more staff at one place, which is needed all over the place, think about how can we combine like things in certain places to process them more quickly, and how can we look at this as an overall system instead of a bunch of discrete crossings where they're all treated as separate from what's around them.
Thank you, Ben. One of the things that you mentioned at the very end there is the role of private enterprise. And CBX is a prime example of that. It's a very contained, much more sterile, I guess, as you were getting at, Alan, type of facility and situation. But I wanted to get back to Eric in terms of focusing resources on the things that need to happen, on the projects that need to be done. And if you can talk to us a little bit about this study and why that is important, not just for UCP, perhaps for many other technological innovations at the border.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gustavo. So circling back to Ben's comment about moving the border away from the border, which is a concept that has been kicking around out there for quite some time. It just occurs to me that UCP is the opposite of that in many key ways. So that's why I say we're in a period of an interesting period of transition here. Let's hear a little bit about this. So, first off, this is a project update. These are not definitive conclusions. I just want to put that disclaimer out there at the beginning. Real quick about us, the North American Research Partnership. We are a 501c3 nonprofit corporation based in Arizona. We also have presence through my esteemed colleague Rick Van Scoik in San Diego and Tijuana. Lots and lots of focus on the U.S. Mexico border. Unfortunately, not as much work done on the U.S. Canada border to this point. These are a few of the projects that we've been working on recently. Done a lot of work with the Mexico Institute, obviously, competitive border communities, the state of the border report that Gustavo mentioned, and the U.S. Mexico border economy and transition, all grouped within a few years, a few months of each other, actually. Congratulations again to Chris and Duncan for keeping this event going through the years. Just a little bit about this project. It was selected for funding under the 2017 U.S. Mexico Border 2020 program through EPA's, through EPA's Region 9 office. The Border 2020 program, if you don't know anything about it, it is a binational kind of bottom-up process for rolling out projects, environmental projects at the U.S. Mexico border. This process and projects are managed by the North American Development Bank. So we were awarded these funds just recently. The time frame is basically all of this year, so we're about halfway through. We're leading this, but we're working with two fantastic partners, and one is Ken Morris at Cross Border Group. Ken has done at-border surveys at 22 U.S.-Mexico ports of entry. He's also worked on the U.S.-Canada border, does some just absolutely fantastic, very detailed work. Tom Keir is formerly of Cambridge Systematics, UC Davis. He is the transportation engineer that is working with us on this project. Even backing up a little bit more, our area of focus is Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora. Nogales, Arizona is currently in non-attainment status for PM10 and PM2.5. So there's a big air quality issue in that part of the border region, as there is in many parts of the border region. Trucks are part of that issue, and so vehicle emissions are PM2.5. But the PM10 is, you can think of that as dust and larger particles. So big air quality issues all throughout the U.S.-Mexico border region, specifically in Nogales. We combined that with the UCP program, which came about and was, as the commissioner said, was rolled out in Nogales in 2016, which is a remarkable program in many ways. I mean, I think this includes both its institutional history, which Jose Martin Garcia talked a little bit about this. Two programs were combined into one program. It's an idea that goes back many, many years in the border region. The idea of a despacho conjunto, the Mexican term for this, goes back at least to the 1970s, according to Russ Jones, and is possibly older than that. So there are some precursors to this program. Also has very interesting personal history. The commissioner mentioned Director Will Brooks, who worked the last couple of years and months of his life on this program. There's a lot of interesting drama around this program. So the idea, the desired outcomes of this are to analyze the environmental impact of the UCP program. It's interesting how this came about. CBP and Aduanas, I think we can be Pretty sure that they did not develop this as a quality of life type of program or as a program to address air quality, but there was conversation around the program right from the beginning that this might have a positive impact on air quality. So we were talking to folks in Nogales that noted a drop in border wait times for trucks from 4 or 5 hours to a half an hour. And so our thinking was, and the thinking of a lot of people was that must have a very significant, or at least a significant impact on air quality at the border. In Nogales, I should mention this, 10% of trucks that cross there are registered in the UCP program. So during high season, if you're looking at just 1,600 trucks, it's a major port, but just 1,600 trucks passing through Nogales daily, about 150, 160 of those trucks are in the UCP program. Still, we're talking about a lot of hours of idling and creeping that are avoided, so this should have an impact. We want to improve our understanding of what the relationship is. There's a number of factors here. There's border wait times. There's the program enrollment, as well as what that means for emissions. And we should be able to make some interesting recommendations to CBP and aduanas as a result of what we find. So just to summarize our research, part of this is to collect northbound wait time data. And I should back up a second. At this time, the UCP program is mostly a northbound program. San Luis, Arizona does have a southbound UCP facility at this time. So collect northbound border wait time data, and there's several sources for that. CBP, Arizona Department of Transportation collects that data. We did our own border wait time survey as well as we were doing this. And then we did surveys of UCP and non-UCP trucks. We surveyed about, or almost exactly, 400 truck drivers. Both registered in the program, working within the program, and who are working in the regular lanes. We surveyed them. For folks who know Nogales, maybe one of the questions is, where would you survey them? We did not work within the CBP compound. We didn't work within the aduanas compound. We're actually granted a little space in the fiscal corridor. The folks at Vías Concesionadas del Norte granted us some space to do the surveys, and that was key. It ended up being a good spot to do this. So the idea is to combine vehicle activity data. Are people idling? Are they moving forward slowly? Are they moving through quickly? With emission rates that are estimated by an EPA simulator, the MOVE simulator. EPA actually has a tool for estimating emissions. And so roughly speaking, for a layman, all you need to know is that the vehicle profiles, we're asking folks, how old is your truck? Where do you buy your gas? The diesel's a little bit different in the United States and Mexico. And with border wait time data, you should be able to estimate air emissions. And again, we're estimating, we're analyzing PM 2.5 and PM 10. There are other pollutants out there that do not fall within this study. So here's a nice view of the Nogales Mariposa port of entry. There is, in the lower left-hand corner of this, you can see a couple of members of our team who were working on surveys. We worked there in April, and in May we did 2 waves of surveys. Right there. That's right. That's right. Thank you, Alan. Right down here, the lower left-hand corner. And
I feel like Vanna White.
That's right. That's right. Appreciate that. Here's a member of our team talking to the drivers. The drivers were, I'd have to say, very, very cooperative with us during this process. We were out there for 2 weeks total in April and May. It was getting a little bit hot there in May. I have to say I was down there and it was roasting a couple of those days. So what have we learned so far? What's the status of this? So we've collected 400 surveys, and we have that data. Like I said, in 2 waves. What do those surveys tell us? There's about 29 questions total, but they tell us things like vehicle weight class, how old these trucks are, where the fuel was purchased. Do the trucks use idling technology that helps reduce their emissions or not? And so things of this nature, and then we're going to put this into our analysis and see what we come up with here over the next couple of months. What are some things that we can say at this time? I mean, these are not definitive conclusions, but what we definitely saw with that was that the flows were highly variable based on events occurring both at and away from the border. A lot of things can happen in a border environment, as you well know, Alan. There was some interesting things that happened. CBP system would go down. You'd have ACE outages that would affect what was happening if the trucks were moving or not. The WANA system would go down occasionally. There was one morning when no one was out there. We were confused. What's going on? There had been a big party in a town just south of Nogales, and everyone was kind of, I guess, recovering from that party. And so that day, the trucking was a little bit delayed. And also the queuing is absolutely key. Nogales is unique and complex. There's a concessionaire there. It's a private concession, the fiscal corridor, and there's lots of issues with how trucks queue there on the Mexican side. It's not patrolled. There's no active traffic management there in Nogales. And quite frankly, it's amazing that it functions as smoothly as it does. So there are also some indications that UCP trucks have a lower emission profile than non-UCP trucks, as they tend to be younger, have more idle reduction technologies, et cetera. For example, 74% of the trucks that were registered in UCP that we talked to were model 2000 or younger, as opposed to 62% in the regular lanes that were from model year 2000 or later. So we've got these data points at this point. The next step is to do a detailed analysis and then write up a final report for EPA and NADBank here later this year. So that's where we are right now. I'd be glad to take questions or
Thank you.
comments.
No, thank you. I guess, Eric, I would ask the question, what is the end game here? I mean, what are we after? I mean, what are the consequences of that study? I mean, what is it going to produce? Is it going to get more resources to the port? Is it going to allow CBP to benchmark, and to say, this is what we should do at the other ports? I want to talk a little bit about the hows. How do we get organized here? Traditionally, we've had a conversation between governments, between agencies, between these organizations, and we've heard some great progress. I mean, I couldn't believe the amount of progress that the Mexican side had actually made through Jose Martin's conversation with us this morning. I mean, we had known about some of the initiatives coming from the Mexican side, but it really is unbelievable, the amount of cooperation and I would say creativity that is coming from the Mexican side. We don't have enough of that, and we're not sharing enough of it, let alone, of course, including private enterprise in spurring some of these things to happen. So this is more of a question for Alan and Ben. How do we get organized in a way that private enterprise works with the agencies? We as a coalition, it's hard. You sit down with these people, they have different interests, different priorities. Some people don't want to share information. There's a lot of jealousy. So how do we get some of these things done and prioritize?
I'll give you some comments that I will take from 2 commissioners that I had the opportunity to work for. First, Commissioner Burson was the one who created within CBP this mantra, this way of doing businesses, co-creation and bidirectional education. So as you alluded to, Gustavo, you have to have the trade community, the entire community, in the room as you're co-creating the way forward, because everybody has to be able to buy in. Because I'm going to deviate real quick and answer your question. Earlier you said, why aren't ports on the southern border open 24 hours a day? Well, CBP did extend hours of operation, particularly under Mr. Winkowski. Nobody showed up. It was like a field of dreams. So unless there's a whole infrastructure established where on the northern border, where plants are open, people are being compensated accordingly, all of a sudden the community said, well, we're not paying drivers extra money. Then they're going to get on the other side. And in CBP, we used to have an expression, customs, when is fast, too fast. So, well, now they're going to get to their destination, but nobody's open. So now they're going to be idling, waiting. So that was that one. And then the other one, I think, is also from Commissioner Bonner, right after 9/11. Don't let perfection undermine the good. He always used to tell us right after 9/11, as soon as you get 70% complete, implement. We could always implement, and then we can amend. The greatest criticism we'll get is if we're not doing anything, if we're letting the striving for perfection just stagnate us. So I think it's that kind of way of thinking and full engagement with the trade community, or the whole community at large that's impacted by this.
I absolutely agree with what Al was saying, and I'd like to address sort of one specific place where coordination with private industry has been challenging, and that's sort of to what you mentioned before, this infrastructure deficit. I think there's broad recognition that the funds, federal funds that are coming from that are being appropriated by the U.S. Congress for new infrastructure investment are very limited, and that we're going to have to draw private capital into this and find ways to make public-private partnerships attractive in order to meet a lot of the needs that we have for new kinds of crossings, and that's been very challenging, and it's been very challenging for a couple reasons. I think one is just that it's a binational regulatory environment is inherently scary for infrastructure investors. A lot of them aren't used to dealing with two different governments at every level as they're doing it. And another piece that's been difficult is unpredictability and sort of open questions about exactly how much, particularly the U.S. government, will support things and what private investors are gonna have to pay for. The bridge Stan runs is privately owned, but they lease it to CBP, and CBP pays the cost of the officers. Now, for new bridges, the message that CBP will send to people is that they have to pay all of the officer costs. And even with public partnerships like the aforementioned Otay Mesa East Port of Entry, it's not totally clear where all of the costs are going to land, whether that's going to be totally borne by the community or the people who are putting together the project, or whether CBP will be able to take some of them. And so all of this, if you're a private investor, this is a lot of regulatory risk, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of really specific knowledge you need in order to even develop these kinds of projects, where you'd have to have a sophisticated understanding of both governments and all of their processes and how they're going to think about this. And what I think, at least we didn't do when I was in government, was present a central sort of access point for potential project sponsors, a place where they could have access to expertise from both governments, where they could interact with the right people and be connected to the right processes, and even understand all of these different steps they had to go through. I think we saw this with the Cross-Border Express, where they got their presidential permit and then came to CBP and were like, great, let's staff the facility. And then they had to negotiate another 6 years about staffing costs for this. And so, those kind of things, you need a very determined project sponsor to do. And so I would just say that a few of the things that we talked about a lot, but that I think are really needed in order to attract the kind of private investment we want. We need a bilateral process that coordinates infrastructure investments for what we do have, and that I believe is done to a limited extent through the 21st Century Border process, but something that really makes it clear, where money is going to be put in a way that people can understand, so that they can understand where there are opportunities that are not receiving federal funding. And then a place for project sponsors to engage with both governments, where they can benefit from expertise and where they can actually work through a lot of these regulatory problems with projects. And I think if our approach is basically, we're open to it now, but project sponsors, please figure everything out and present us something. And even then, you're not totally sure if it's going to be approved or if there's going to be some other problem. I think that's unlikely to result in the kind of investments we need. So figuring out how to improve the environment for public-private partnerships and private investment or investment from other outside entities in border crossings is something where there's, I think, still a good amount of work to be done to organize ourselves effectively.
Thank you, Ben. Stan, I know you wanted to chime in.
Let me some specifics. On the northern border, we're private. The other bridges are run by public authorities, and so they're not for profit. They get appointed board of directors from each side of the border, different governance models, but all the money they take in from their tolls, they invest in bridges, in their own bridges, in the infrastructure, and in new programs. And I have to say that CBP and CBSA, Canada Customs, since 9/11 have really come to engage with the border operators. We have our own little association, and I sit on 2 task forces, one for each. I'm going to Buffalo next week, and how we could work together and improve, given the fiscal situation that CBP and CBSA faces with their, we'll build infrastructure for them and not charge the GSA lease for it because we're putting in more booths. I know when I was at Blue Water Bridge, I sat with the DFO, having horrible backups coming into the United States. Now, I'm in Canada, okay, the authority run the Canadian half of the bridge, and the U.S. MDOT ran the U.S. half of the bridge. We sat down at lunch and on a piece of paper scratched out an idea to put some staggered booths in and some stacked booths in. He goes, Stan, that's great, but we can't pay for it. I said, we will pay for it. See, us Canadians are good sometimes. We'll pay for it. It was... Oh gosh, I forget how much it turned out to be, $1.1 million or something like that. But we did it. They put in the equipment for it, and the next July 4th, July 1st long weekend that we had, when cars and trucks used to be queued up for miles and miles, there was nothing because they had the extra booths and they had the staff to put in there. So. That happens a lot. We work with them, and yeah, we'll pay for it. And I know this is where the donation acceptance program kind of got formalized, and the reimbursable services. By the way, we don't do the reimbursable services on the northern border. There's not been any of the border operators in our association that have gone to that program. The staff, we're pretty happy with the staffing levels that we have with CBP on the northern border, which I know again is different from everybody down on the southern border.
We have heard recently from CBP's Innovations Acquisition Program about a number of, it's like dozens of different projects, pilot projects happening on the border once again, and we heard it from the commissioner today. So there's emphasis on technology. So the timing seems to be one where if we could get private enterprise, the agencies together, even with the political headwinds in both countries, and the NAFTA situation, do you think this is what is it going to take for us to make that leap and say we are actually going to work together and get this thing done? Ben, you referred to the 21st Century Border Management and that initiative that was created by Presidents Peña and Obama. And we have the Joint Working Group, the committee. We have the Bridges and Border Crossings Group. But I've noticed that these groups rarely have private enterprise involved. And the tremendous projects, beautiful results, but it's still not getting us where we need to be. Is this the right timing to have a quantum leap, I guess I would call it, for that level of cooperation? Can we do that, Alan?
I think so, but I think what has to be demonstrated is the ROI, the return on investment. So let me give you a great example years ago of what actually happened, even though there was the best of intentions by both parties. So years ago, customs inspectors, is what we would call back then, we used to physically examine the cargo. This was before all the large-scale NII. And in the New York, New Jersey area, we had a lot of what are called CESs, container examination sites. And the Customs Service ran them. Well, then the Customs Service decided to allow them to be run by private industry. So then all of a sudden the private industry would bid on these CESs, and they started operating them. So as they began to operate them, all of a sudden Customs became much more attuned to risk management. So examine less and find more. So as we were saying, we're going to examine less, these private-run CESs were saying, you need to send more cargo to us. We're not making any money. We make money on the shipments that we examine. So your new policy of risk management is sending less containers to the CES. So I think it was a great lesson learned that whatever partnership you go forward with, unless somebody wants an ROI that's intangible, wants greater facilitation. But if somebody like who builds in this area express lanes and then gets to charge a toll for the next 30 years, that ROI has to be factored in up front so you don't end up with unintended consequences. But I think if you can factor that in, I think there'll be an attraction by entities to put forth capital to make this fun. And then the last comment is just the white elephant in the room. It's going to be competing with federal money that might be going to a war.
Thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, if I could just really quickly follow up on that. I mean, I should just say before, I did not mean the comment about the different arrangement for leasing at the Ambassador Bridge with other ones. I in no way intended that as any kind of criticism, but as just
we took it
an example of the sort of incoherence of the way that the U.S. government has approached a lot of these things. My opinion on this is that this is the point where there are huge opportunities for investment in border infrastructure and border crossings, when there is a great deal of uncertainty, and because when there's a great deal of uncertainty, and when many people, frankly, might be scared away from the situation. I mean, these are not the kind of projects where you build it and then 5 years later you exit or something. I mean, the Ambassador Bridge is 90 years old. There's still 12,000 trucks a day going across it. When you build a bridge, when you establish a border crossing, these are very, very long-term projects that are going to generate income and other kind of opportunities very far into the future. And I think what it'll require is a way to match the kinds of investors who are interested both in sort of the proven revenue that can be generated from these through tolls, but also the other kinds of developments that can go with them, and whether that's things like duty-free or whether that's thinking really intelligently about how border crossings can be combined with either industrial developments or specific places where certain passengers want to see, certain pedestrians and passengers might want to cross a lot, but being a little more creative about that and matching those up with the folks in government who have the expertise and can help show them or help get them through the approvals process and make sure that those are aligned. I think that's going to be the challenge. But to my mind, I think there's no question that there's a huge opportunity right now and a huge need on the border. And if that can be matched up effectively, I think there could be some really.
Yeah, let me give you two quick examples of that. It goes along with what Ben was saying. I think you got to work with not the political level on the stuff. You work with the people on the ground because they want the border to work well too. They take the stress off of their officers. They don't like the backups any more than we do. Two things that and you, because of budget challenges, the border operators, you pony up for it, but if it's going to make things, just like I talked about the booths before, 1.6 million, but made a huge difference for us. There's a new pilot that we're going to be doing with CBSA starting in the fall for commercial trucks. It'll start with, it'll be fast CT pad carriers, trusted. They haven't announced who yet. Basically, the truck will pull up pre-commercial pill coming into Canada. Driver holds up the barcode. It gets scanned. They'll have the thing there. He'll look in the camera, facial recognition. The light will turn from red to yellow. He'll start moving forward, and an officer who's not even in the booth, they've already sent their information ahead and all that stuff, turns the light green, the truck takes off, is gone. At the same time as that truck is doing that, the next truck pulls in, does the same thing. So it's a stop and a go, and here comes another truck, stop and a go. It's going to be, the whole thing will probably take 10 seconds, everything else equal. Truck has to go into secondary, they have a procedure, red light, and they'll direct them into secondary. So they've been working on this. We're working with them on it. We're going to pay for a lot of the hardware and stuff that's got to go in there. But at the end of the day, if it works, my God, we've gone from a truck that would take 80 seconds to process 90 to one that takes 10. You know, so there's your ROI, and
Right.
of course, and all this will be done. And the other one is what they call E-Gate Nexus on the northern borders, like your Sentry on the southern border. They've done it where you pull up to the booth. They piloted it at the Peace Bridge, and we're going to get it at our bridge, and we want 5 of these lanes. There's nobody in the booth. You look in the camera, you hold up the card, and the officer inside, asks you the questions, and again, green light or the gate goes up, and you go. The key to that is you can get, there are a lot of officers who can't work the front line because of injury or in Canada if they haven't able to qualify to carry a gun. So these people are, I wouldn't say they're useless, but they're no good on the front line to open up booths. So now you've got them back to work. They're inside where it's safe. And those officers who would man those booths, they go to the other booths that were unmanned, or they didn't have. So it's a resource saving issue, and it's a lot more efficient. So, you know, those two things, and we're going to have to pay to get this technology in there. But at the end of the day, it helps us as an operator, helps the border work better, and everybody's happy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions. Please, just one. Russ?
I was quick. The problem with DAP and the 3PLs for the southern border, given the gap in infrastructure is so huge, is it's not so much ROI, but it's how do you retire debt in a manner that you can eliminate the debt for the investment in the infrastructure. If you can do that, that means Congress has got to act to modify DAP so that we can do that. And I believe the communities on the border will provide that infrastructure because of the quality of life issues, the environmental issues, all of the above. To the comment that Eric made about unified cargo processing being kind of not pre-processing it, Eric, it depends on your point of view. Because Mexican Customs inspects more than U.S., having Mexican Customs inspected at U.S. gives us greater inspection, and we're basically, from the perspective that they're looking at, it's pre-processing for them. And so it improves the process by eliminating redundancy. With that in mind, I want to bring up this issue of essential and priorities, and this is something Benjamin brought up. Federal Motor Carriers has a joint jurisdiction with the border with the U.S. states, unlike Mexico, with regard to vehicle safety. They have the same standards. The inspectors do the same thing, yet we have this redundancy. It was announced at last year's conference here by Federal Motor Carriers that they had the money and they were going to have their own bricks and mortar at all the southern ports. They don't have one at the northern ports, but they are going to have them at all the southern ports. And I know they've done it in Santa Teresa. So now you have a Federal Motor Carriers facility, you have a New Mexico Motor Carriers safety facility, and they don't even work together. So I look at that as kind of a step backward if we're going to have duplicated, redundant safety inspections using the same standards, one's federal, one state, on the U.S. side of the border, inside the campus where we're trying to process this. What are your comments?
Sure. Just to go back to the point I made earlier. I think we need to take a hard look at what has to be done at the border and what doesn't. And I think we need to take a look at it from the perspective of anything that causes a delay at the actual port of entry, or something that has the capability to, where a backup could feed into other parts of the port, will have an outsized effect on overall traffic in a way that another inefficiency in a different place might not. And so going through and looking at whether it's safety inspections that are being done, or whether it's other elements of processing that could be really reviewed and see if there are places where those could be separated out with the eye to make sure that the place where all of the crossing has to be consolidated into a single point is moving as fast as possible. I think would would be worthwhile and would probably lead to some conclusions about the way that we design ports and the way that we operate them that are pretty different from the way we've treated them historically.
Thank you. I'd like to ask for a round of applause for Ben, Stan, Eric, and Alan. Thank you, gentlemen.